Hello, everyone. I want to welcome you to our next episode of the Buckeye War Room. I'm Jim Renacci, former United States Congressman and former Senate candidate. And as we've done in many cases with the War Room, we're discussing issues that affect Ohioans, Ohioan voters, whether they're national or whether they're local. We want to talk about them and have guests who can actually explain some of the situations we're talking about. On today's episode, I'm so proud to have somebody who I worked with in Congress. You know, when I went to the House of Representatives in 2010, the biggest issue that we were talking about was our national debt. And at that time, it was just shy of $10 trillion, and people thought it was way too high. Yet today, as we've crossed over 32 trillion, people aren't even talking about it. And it really is something that I continue to bring up as I travel the state and talk to many groups about our concerns, our issues in Ohio, but also our national concerns. So it's a great pleasure for me to bring an individual on the show today who I've worked with while I was in Congress. Maya MacGuineas, she's the president of Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. This bipartisan group works to highlight our growing debt and economic issues and the divide really between the political parties. She previously worked for the Brookings Institute and on Wall Street in 2009, served a short time on the Washington Post editorial board covering economic policies. Maya, thank you for being here with me today.
Good morning. Great to be with you.
So Maya, I started to talk about some of those things. As I travel the state, it frustrates me. You know, we're still talking about issues like immigration, which I agree is important, the economy, which 100% is important. But look, the backdrop of all this is our national debt is growing and nobody's paying attention to it. So can you kind of explain what your group does and how the committee works?
Sure, happy to. So the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget, tough name, nobody can remember it, but it's been a group that's been around for decades. And one of, I think, the really neat things about the group is it is truly, truly bipartisan. I'm a political independent. It's not about politics at all. And within the group, and importantly on the board, we have folks who've been in government, running the Treasury, the Fed, the budget committees, the Congressional Budget Office, all of the different budget groups from both sides of the aisle. And our focus is really not political at all. It's on the importance of fiscal responsibility. And what that means is it's not a balance the budget group. Sometimes it makes sense to borrow. Well, we were borrowing and we should have borrowed during COVID, for instance. Not all the money was spent in the perfect ways, but it helped us stay out of a deeper recession or depression. But so often what we do is borrow just for political reasons. So the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget works on policy issues with members of Congress, trying to encourage them not to incur such large deficits and debt, which in fact go to undermine all those other issues that you acknowledge is very important. You can't deal with any of them when you have a weak fiscal situation like we do in this country.
Well, you're exactly right. And many people don't understand the drivers of the debt. There's also those individuals that travel the state say, oh, the debt means nothing. It can be wiped out with a signature. You could just eliminate the national debt. It's between two government organizations. I have to try and explain that sometimes too, but why don't you give it your shot as well, why the national debt is a serious issue and it's not something that can be just wiped out.
Yeah, it's a serious issue and it affects every other issue that we deal with. So when you're borrowing too much, which we are, and our debt is at near record levels, in the next 2 years, we will hit the highest we've ever hit debt as a share of GDP in this country. So when your debt's too high, has a number of negative consequences. One, it slows economic growth. The money that is being lent to the government can't be lent for productive investment. It slows productivity growth, that slows the economy, slows standard of living and the wages that we all make. We are all earning less today than we would be if we hadn't borrowed so much in the past, and that's only going to get worse. Number two, it leads to high growing interest payments in your budget. Right now, interest payments in the federal budget are the single fastest growing part of our federal budget. Faster than retirement, faster than healthcare, faster than national defense, interest payments. And in fact, they're the second largest item. Social Security is the only program that's bigger. They are now larger than our national defense spending. So when those squeeze out, those interest payments grow, they squeeze out whether you're conservative and you want tax cuts or you're progressive and you want spending increases. The first dollars go to finance our interest. Another reason to worry is your preparedness for emergencies. We do have to borrow when there's a national emergency or a big recession. You're not able to at low interest rates if you've borrowed so much when you didn't need to. That means you're running out of fiscal space. That could happen at any moment because our debt is so high. Moreover, at this point, it's really a national security risk. So right now, we are borrowing both domestically and from countries abroad, including countries with whom we're not aligned. We're dependent on them for borrowing, and it leaves us vulnerable if we are in national security tensions with other countries, if we also need to borrow for them. In fact, if we need to borrow for them for our national security spending. And then finally, we have huge changes going on in our economy right now with disruptions, dislocations, and yet we have a social safety net that was geared towards the problems of last century, not this century. And we're not really able to think through what should we be doing to deal with how government can help insure against some of the risks of innovation and changes and help smooth those over, because all of our money is already going to promises of the past, including interest payments. Finally, it's just about as unfair as it can be to the next generation as imaginable. Basically, you and I, through our government, are spending a lot of money, not paying for it, and passing the bills on to our kids. And our kids are already going to be inheriting a really complicated world. And the last thing they need is trillions of dollars in debt that we have racked up for them, so that they have to be paying for that before they can even deal with their own priorities as they start to move into the period of governing in their lives. So I can't think of one benefit of the borrowing that we're engaging in other than when it's to avoid a big recession. But it is really just kicking the can down in so many ways.
Maya, you hit on a couple issues there, and it's something I talk about all the time. What are the drivers of our debt? Now, you indicated one of them, of course, was interest, which we know is one of the growing drivers of our debt, national debt. But there are other drivers as well. When I bring those up, people cringe. Sometimes they don't like what I'm saying, but I usually say, based on my experience, based on being on the budget committee, it's Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and interest. So those are the four main drivers of our debt, which are basically laws that have to either be changed. Otherwise, the national debt just continues to grow. Can you kind of broaden that a little bit as well?
Well, I will plus one your comments there, because right now we're in the midst of a political campaign season where everybody's talking about not fixing those programs when they are the very core of what's driving our huge fiscal insecurities. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid growing faster than the rest of the budget, and obviously interest as the fastest growing part. Over the next decade, basically almost 85, close to 90% of the spending growth will come from those programs: retirement, healthcare, and interest. They are driving all of this growth in the budget while other parts of the budget are being squeezed out. Now, lots of people say, keep your hands off Social Security, keep your hands off Medicare. My dad says it to me all the time. I'm only getting what I paid in. A couple myths here that, again, people don't love to hear, but they are true. People actually tend to, on average, get much more out of Social Security and Medicare than they paid in. The reason is growing life expectancy. When those programs started, the retirement age was 65, life expectancy was 62. Today, for Social Security, the retirement age has gone up to 67, but life expectancy is well into the 70s, 80s, and growing very quickly. And so we're spending more and more of our lives in retirement collecting from those huge programs for much longer than it was ever anticipated that we would. Moreover, right now in our federal budget, we spend $6 per people over 65 for every one we spend on people under 18. So we are not investing in the future. We are financing people at the end of their lives and in retirement when many of them could and should still be working. So one of the things that I talk about when I talk about solutions is we should be talking about raising the retirement age for younger workers. They don't expect Social Security to even be there for them. It is going to be, just not in its entirety, because when we hit insolvency in Social Security and Medicare, which we will, roughly a decade, there will be across the board benefit cuts. When people are promising to protect seniors, by the way, the worst thing they can do for Social Security or Medicare is to do nothing. They have to fix those programs so we don't get hit with those automatic across the board benefit and provider cuts. But younger workers, they will get Social Security, just not everything they've been promised because of these benefit cuts. And raising the retirement age and solidifying the ability to get some of those benefits will actually leave them better off. So I'm not saying it's win-win. We've waited so long. We've made this much harder to fix than we should have, but we have to fix those programs, and we need to leave room for other parts of our budget to grow depending on what's important. We have huge risks around the world that weren't anticipated 1 and 2 decades ago. We're going to need to think about more things like cybersecurity or lifelong learning. They're big changes. Our budget needs to be more flexible. And with that big squeeze, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and interest payments, we don't have the flexibility we need to be adapting and nimble as a country in a changing environment.
Well, it's amazing. And when I talk about those things, as you just said, when you talk about Social Security, people just cringe, don't touch my Social Security.
Yeah.
Many don't realize, as you said, they've not paid in enough to what they're taking out. And some of it's because we don't invest it properly either, which is a whole nother issue. But when you're investing in treasury bills, you're not getting enough of a return to keep up with inflation. So all kind of issues are related to this. And Medicare, I know people hate to talk about this, but I wanted to at least touch base and see if you agree. You know, the biggest problem with Medicare, I think we pay in $1.50, take out $3.50, something like that. Those were the numbers when I was in Congress. But the biggest issue with Medicare is the last 6 months of any individual's lives and how much we spend. And when we talked about that, I was on the Medicare subcommittee, the Medicaid subcommittee. People cringe then. You can't talk about that.
No.
But these are issues you would agree that at least have to be addressed.
Of course they do. And we can't talk about anything in this country right now, right? Everything turns into a fight. But budgeting is about trade-offs. And that is exactly the kind of conversation we should be having. Where do we want our healthcare dollars to go? How much of our budget do we want on healthcare? Do we want it to be moving towards 1/3 of the entire budget? Do we want to reorganize how we provide healthcare so that it becomes more efficient? Of course we do. We spend more than any other developed nation on healthcare with worse results. And as you said, the greatest amount of spending is in the last 6 months of life. Now, there's a problem there. We don't know if we're in the last 6 months of life, but we do know when we're making big investments in things that are very unlikely to pay off. And of course, when it's a loved one, any of us would invest anything to save our parent, to save our grandparent. But we need to think about where those dollars should be spent, where the biggest return on those dollars are, and importantly, how to make our healthcare spending more efficient overall. There are a number of changes in the system that are going to happen. But your point is such an important one. Like, people start screaming death panels the moment somebody says this fact, which is most of the spending is at the last 6 months of life and doesn't end up saving lives or prolonging lives for a particularly long time or with particularly high quality. And it's true on every part of our budget. We need to talk about if something is worth doing, it's worth paying for. And let's think about what things are worth doing and therefore prioritize our budget. All of this is very difficult when you have a Congress that doesn't even pass a budget. And I don't know, probably your listeners know this, but a lot of people in the country, including some of the lawmakers, don't realize more years than not right now, they don't even bother to pass a budget. And we go on continuing resolutions and these terrible omnibuses, and sometimes they shut down the government. We should not move forward with any legislation until Congress does the primary duty of passing a budget at the beginning of every year.
Well, I 100% agree with you. And I think the only budget we passed during my time in office was to do the reconciliation budget. And that'll be probably another thing if Republicans are able to gain control, or the Democrats of all three chambers. They'll, reconciliation always is the answer, because that's the only way to get anything done, which is sad. But 100% agree with you. We should be passing a budget. I want to turn to the numbers, see if you can help me confirm this. I'm out on the trail talking about, how much we bring in and how much is spent on Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security interest. Do you have those numbers kind of handy? I know I didn't. I hope I'm not catching you off guard with that. But I always say, we bring in about 4.4 trillion in revenue, and we spend about 4.5 in Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security interest. So I'm trying to tell people that just those programs alone swallow all the revenue that we bring in?
Yeah, that's a great point. So where we are now, the budget's gotten a little bit bigger. So our budget, we bring in about 5 trillion, 4.9 trillion in revenues. Social Security is about 1.5 trillion. Interest is almost a trillion at this point. Medicare is about 850 billion. Medicaid, I think, is about 600 billion. So yeah, you're pretty much on spot that those programs are basically consuming all the revenue, and that we're borrowing to pay for all of the discretionary budget, which is what most people think of as government, with national security, the environment, energy, international affairs, education. So yeah, those big entitlements, they're called, are mandatory spending, which don't go through the budgeting process. They are consuming the bulk of all of the tax revenues that come in.
Yeah, it's interesting. And then once you add defense, which of course should be a priority of our national government, you really are using up a lot of dollars before you even talk about all the other things.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because most people are not aware of that. They don't want to talk about it. They're not interested. But the one other thing I bring to people's attention, and I'll never forget the comptroller, the United States comptroller actually came to a budget hearing at my request because he said that we are heading towards a Greece-like situation. Have you ever heard that comment? And maybe
I have heard that comment. You know, it's interesting because we are different than Greece in the way that we borrow in our own currency. So there's two kind of fiscal crises you can have. You could borrow in a different currency and suddenly you can't pay your interest payments and you would have to default. That won't happen to the US. And this goes back to what you were saying in the very beginning, because we could always print more money. And some people act as though that's not a problem. That's a devastatingly dangerous idea. So if what we do is we just decide to start printing more money, you think the inflation we just went through when we hit 9.1%, the highest it'd been in 40 years, is bad. If we start printing money instead of dealing with our debt, we're going to have hyperinflation. We're going to have massive inflation that will erode all of the savings that people have and put us in a very dangerous price spiral. Interest rates will go up. This will cause more increases in our interest payments, which will lead to more borrowing. So you get stuck in a very dangerous debt cycle that way. The other thing that can happen is it just slowly erodes growth, which I would argue is already the case here. Our economy is more sluggish. Our growth isn't as high as it otherwise would be because our productivity is lagging what it otherwise would be from crowding out. And slowly your resources don't grow as quickly. That can lead to political tension. Yep, we have that. Slower growth and a lower standard of living than you otherwise would have. Yes, we have that. And it's almost, as a great economist, Charlie Schultz called it, the termites in the basement, where it's slowly eroding away at the foundation of everything in your economy and your country, and you don't even really realize it. So yes, we could have a huge crisis, interest rates, inflation, all of those things. We probably won't default, but we could wreck our economy, or we could have the slow burn, kind of the frog in the boiling water, where we don't even notice. And it's not exaggerating to say we can wake up and not be the strongest economy in the world in a blink of an eye if we continue to borrow on the path that we are.
And you touch on something there that I think is important. I try and bring up the COVID crisis actually, and the spending related to the COVID crisis did help drive inflation. Would you agree with that? Because
absolutely. So inflation came. So when we were borrowing for COVID, it was absolutely critical that we did borrow. We borrowed, like I said, a lot of the programs weren't ideal, but they did quite a remarkable job of using the money, targeting it in ways that really helped avert a much larger crisis. That borrowing initially was all bipartisan, which is, we act like it's a big deal. It's not that hard to get Republicans and Democrats to come together and borrow more money. What's hard is to get them to repay some of the borrowed money. But we did then, when Biden came into office, we had the American Rescue Plan, and that was too much money for the economy to handle. We had just passed another stimulus bill that was bipartisan. Then they passed another bill that was just Democratic financed, and too many things went into that bill, and it was too large for the economy, and it kicked off inflation. And that was then exacerbated by supply chain problems during COVID from China and other places. And then that was exacerbated by oil shocks that came from Russia invading Ukraine. So we had a trifecta there, which led to inflation. But absolutely, the excessive borrowing was a reminder of what some people have tried to deny. But if you flood the economy with cheap money or borrow more than your economy can handle, that's going to lead to inflation, higher interest rates. As a result, our interest payments are much, much higher than they were before. Again, fastest growing part of the budget, and it kicks off a dangerous cycle very quickly. And that is what happened, and that could happen again.
And you're right, and that was bipartisan-led spending. I'm glad you said that, because a lot of people always want to point fingers, well, it was Republicans, Democrats. It was bipartisan spending that really started to drive the spending habits that caused some of this inflation.
Well, it's interesting because bipartisan problems are a big part of this right now. There's always been this generalization that Republicans cut taxes and Democrats increase spending. Those were accurate, but what's more accurate is actually Republicans and Democrats cut taxes, and Republicans and Democrats grow spending. If you look at what happened under Trump or under Biden, both of those tenures oversaw big tax cuts and big spending increases, many of which were bipartisan. And so there's always all this finger pointing. The way I would generalize, unfortunately, is incumbent policymakers like to do things that are easy, and they don't like to pay for them. They like to give away tax cuts. They like to grow spending. We as voters all like to have them. We love that promise that you don't need to pay for things, but it isn't true. It is really damaging to the economy. It is really damaging to our national security, and it's really undermining of our future. And so we are stuck in a bipartisan agreement not to budget, certainly not to budget responsibly. And we are on a path that is unsustainable with our debt growing faster than our economy forever if we don't have our lawmakers starting to make some changes.
I got to ask you, do you still have that computer program where you can adjust something and see what the effects are?
Yeah.
I remember John Carney and I sitting in a room, Democrat and Republican, saying, okay, what? And it was very difficult.
You guys were great. I mean, I just have to say, when you were in office, you really worked on this issue. You really cared about it. And as you said, you did it and you led it in a bipartisan way. And I really wish we had more members who are doing that these days. That is a great exercise. We call it the debt fixer. And we have a lot of these interactive tools on the website, but it allows members of Congress or people throwing what I think is a fun party on a Friday night, bring your friends and sit around and try to fix the debt. But it's really interesting because it shows you, okay, if you want to extend the tax cuts, that's going to make the $10 trillion it would cost just to keep the debt as a share of the economy where it is. That's going to make that 50% harder if you want to extend those tax cuts. And if you think you can fix this just by, making a few changes here or there, you might be surprised how hard it is and what things generate a lot of savings and what things not so much. But I definitely encourage people to work through the debt fixer. I think it's a very educational and fun tool that hopefully will get people a little bit more engaged in this whole process of what we should be doing about our budget.
It is important. I just ran into somebody the other day. So I could fix Social Security. All you have to do is all payroll has to be taxed. You shouldn't cap it. And I go, you don't realize how little of a change that makes. There are so few people that make money over the cap that the difference is immaterial.
Well, it's not. It used to be years ago. If they had lifted that cap, you could have made a huge amount of difference. But we've waited so long; it's now not close to enough to fix the program. And so it's also a reminder of why kicking the can does so much damage. Because if we had made the changes to Social Security decades ago, when people were warning about it first, nobody would have even noticed the changes. Now they're going to have to be pretty significant because the program's insolvent. In 9 years, less than a decade, there will be across-the-board benefit cuts of over 22%. That makes a big difference for the widow who depends on this program. And it's frankly unconscionable that we haven't done anything to fix this program in advance of when we are going to be forced to with such draconian across-the-board spending cuts.
Mine, I don't know if you remember when I was in there with Paul Ryan, and we talked about issues where we fixed and adjusted things for people 55 and younger, but anyone 55 and older, they were guaranteed the benefits, and people scream bloody murder. But you're right, if we would have done some of those things then, it would have been less adjustments than it's going to be now. I think that's what you're saying.
Exactly. Exactly. Why, by waiting, we've made it much more painful than it ever had to be because they could have been spread out over so many more people.
So let's talk about a couple other things before we close. I mean, we have two presidential candidates. I continue. By the way, one of the reasons I left Congress is because I get so fed up with people not wanting to address this stuff.
Yeah.
And now we have two presidential candidates, both talking about, not taxing on, whether it's Social Security benefits, whether it's overtime benefits, whether it's tips, all of these things. And we know, I tell everybody, the tax code just drives businesses to do certain things. It adjusts. You adjust to the code. It doesn't become an automatic savings. And in the end, I've seen things on the internet, analysis where, and I think your committee has also done one where the Trump economic policies versus the Harris, both of them are going to expand the budget. I think Trump's going to expand it even more. But can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can. It's very discouraging because the presidential election is the only time you can really create a mandate for change. And we are having a mandate for very reckless policies, no matter where we go. So neither candidate is emphasizing the importance of dealing with our fiscal problems. Neither candidate has put forward a plan that would do anything to improve the fiscal situation. And both of them have put forth plans that would add trillions to the debt. We do have a recent analysis that's out, and then we have ranges for both candidates. But of the central estimate, we find that Harris would add $3.5 trillion over 10 years to the debt, and that Trump would add $7.5 trillion over that same time period. Both are abysmal, and they're huge ranges depending on how these policies would be implemented. We talked to the campaigns, talked through these issues. And both of them will say, oh, no, we're going to grow our way out of it, or we're not going to really borrow so much. But unfortunately, we often see that things are actually even worse than the promises that candidates talk about, depending on the makeup of Congress, without them emphasizing the need to fix this problem. And on top of that, promising not to fix Social Security or Medicare. They're being completely opaque about what's necessary to fix those programs. We are set up for another 4 years of borrowing, which will be the same time when we hit the record levels of national debt, when our interest payments will continue to grow. And it's damaging. And like you said, they're basically in a competition to create like fiscal giveaways. This patchwork of tax cut promises is so, stupid. It's just bad tax policy. We are in the midst of huge global shifts. We are, pulling back from globalization and open trade, huge technological innovations. We need big structural economic visions to help the country grow and prosper. There's a lot of opportunity out there. There's also a lot of risk. We need to be thinking about this at a high visionary level. And instead it's like, oh, you won't tax tips? I won't tax tips either. And it's like little kids basically fighting to get more dessert. It's just, it is the opposite of the kind of leadership, the fiscal leadership that we need right now to watch these tax giveaways. And like you said, people and companies respond to incentives, and these are not incentives that are going to help the economy at all. These are incentives that are just going to continue to bring us into kind of an economic quagmire where we are not able to realize the levels of sustainable growth that we otherwise would.
Well, one thing that former President Trump said is he's going to pay down the deficit by these tariffs. And I think that's a great talking point. The problem is, and I want to hear what your thoughts are, tariffs will slow down the economy. It'll raise prices. But tell me your thoughts on these tariffs.
So we try to be as policy neutral as possible in our work, because the point is, we have a country filled with different preferences, and that's okay. We just think that you should pay for what you spend. So the tariffs would raise revenue, and the tariffs would slow economic growth, and the tariffs would be inflationary. All of those things are true. I think it's legitimate for somebody to say, listen, these tariffs are about national security as much as they are about economics, but we do need to raise revenue. And when you think about how to raise revenue, you want to think about how to do so without hurting growth as much as possible. And I think there's no question that this huge, he's talking about 60% tariffs on China, 10 and 20% in other parts of the country, that they would be very damaging for growth. Again, you could make the case they'll have national security effects that are important, but they will certainly slow growth, despite the fact that they will raise some of the revenues we need to bring down the debt. So I hope that was a nuanced enough answer that they generate the largest portion of revenue from his plan, but we also don't know what the response from other countries will be. And it is unlikely to be that they will sit there happily and accept these huge tariffs without responses of their own that will do further damage to growth.
Very good. So again, we could spend hours talking, and I'd love for the people, yeah, and I'd love for the people to get to know your organization better. So you can tell people a little bit about how they can get in touch with your organization, what they can do, maybe even how they can help, so that they have a better idea and they can go to your site and learn even more.
Yeah, please. Thank you for the opportunity. But the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, CRFBA, CRFB.org. You can go, you can sign up for, I think what's really great about, we put out a lot of policy work, and it is politically neutral. You're not going to be getting a political bias from this. There are different preferences, big government, small government, fix it with taxes, fix it with spending. We're neutral in all of those things, but you'll get a great evaluation of the issues out there. We also love for folks to get involved. We're building state operations. Because the lawmakers don't hear from people in the states that they care about this issue. So we need people to get involved and engaged and reach out to their lawmakers. So anybody can email us at the website, crfb.org, and you'll get a call back of people who would love to engage you, learning more about the issue, volunteering on the issue, connecting with your lawmakers, bringing it up in the campaign. We only have a few more weeks, but the more the candidates hear that people care about the debt, the more we get them to talk about it, the more hopefully they're not going to turn around in the next few weeks and make great plans, but hopefully they'll understand that it is an issue that matters to voters and that we're not just looking for huge handouts of tax cuts and spending increases. We care about preserving the economy and the fiscal strength of the country. So please reach out, and thanks for the opportunity to let people know. I think it's a great organization. Obviously, I love what we do, but the more you learn about the budget, I think the more interesting it is, and the more it becomes clear how important it is.
Well, look, I love what you do, and I was appreciative when I was in Congress of getting to know you and your organization. You were very helpful. In the end, you were so helpful that you helped me get out of there, because I hate to say it, I realized that we were just up against it. Yeah, we just weren't getting anywhere, and people were not willing to make the tough decisions. I don't know how many kicks in the side I got because I would bring up this issue in a Republican event, and I thought, this is ridiculous. Republicans, as well as Democrats, want to ignore the fact that we are growing a national deficit that's going to be harmful and could have implications of national security, and nobody wants to talk about it.
Yeah, you were right then, and you are right now, and we need voices of people who care about it. So thanks for your continuing to ring the warning bell on this.
Well, thank you again, and I want to thank you, Maya, for being on this episode of Buckeye War Room. This is Jim Renacci. Again, hopefully you got good information about the national debt. This is what the Buckeye War Room is all about, getting information out, whether it's state issues, federal issues, but this is such an important issue. This will affect not only our national government, but it also affects our local governments, our state governments. Spending is spending, whether it's at the top or at the bottom. So thank you for being here, and this is Jim Renacci signing off on another episode of Buckeye War Room.